All right, thanks everyone. We'll begin. First, greetings, good afternoon. Thank you for joining me today. My name is John-Paul Ferguson. I'm the academic director of the MBA program here at McGill at the Desautels Faculty of Management. I'm also an associate professor of organizational behavior, which is the branch of getting an MBA where no one knows what that is, but it's just a fancy term for the people who teach management within the school. I'm going to be talking today about trends we see in sustainable management within firms, really more so than trends in sustainable management education. I want to talk about the difference between those. And so before we dive into the meat of the matter, let me just say a bit about McGill Desautels. If you're on this call, you may already have experience with Montreal. Let me say it is the best thing I can say about Montreal is that I moved here 5 years ago from the Bay Area in California and have never regretted it once. This is not only a fellow interesting city in North America, a real hub for things like artificial intelligence, machine language processing, and other interesting new technologies. Also, frankly, one of the best cities in the world to live in as a graduate student, which is always important, particularly for potential students to keep in mind. A real standout when it comes to the arts, to food, to music. And for me, also a place that's really known for its diversity, something I've always enjoyed. This is a very young city and a very cosmopolitan city where fully a fourth of the people here come from overseas. McGill itself we just celebrated our 200th anniversary a couple of years ago, and we really are in the heart of Montreal. This is always a trick of how we do our stock footage and photography at McGill, that we make sure to get photos of the leafy trees and the mountains in the background. And in fact, if you were to spin around 180 degrees from almost any of the photos that I'm showing on the screen right now, you would see the beginnings of the financial district right across Sherbrooke Street. And so the fact that you can sort of live and work within blocks of campus has always been a real benefit. Desautels sits at the heart of that right here on McTavish Street at McGill. The MBA program also celebrated its 100th anniversary not long ago. We sit as one of the top 3 MBAs in Canada. That bounces around from year to year as basically we engage in a 3-way thumb wrestle with Rotman at the University of Toronto and Smith at Queen's. But what really makes us stand out is compared to those programs, first, we've always tried to have a smaller cohort at Desautels, which many of our alumni have always valued for the tight network and the connections that forms. We're also by far the most internationalized cohort of any MBA program in Canada, with more than 70% of our students coming from outside North America. Indeed, we've had over 60 countries represented in the MBA in the last few years. So with that in mind, I want to dive into the content, really the meat of today's discussion. And I want to talk about sustainable management. I want to discuss what are the interests that firms have in sustainable management trends we've seen in the last year or so, and both what I think is good about that, but also what I see as some of the potential risks and how that fits into things like getting an MBA. Because frankly, to give you the spoiler alert at the beginning, because this is not a mystery story, I think that the reason that we need MBAs is the focus for many firms has become on reporting and covering the processes that they have for that kind of reporting. And the argument I'm going to make over the next bit before we go into the Q&A is that reporting by itself is not enough. And unless you have managers that are thinking about how to actually implement sustainable management practices in your organization, ultimately we're going to see a lot of ceremonial compliance with reporting regulations, but not necessarily a lot of change in firm practice. So basic idea, I want to make sure that we're all on the same page when I say what is sustainable management in the first place. And then I want to get into what firms are looking for, what I see as the risks associated with what they're looking for, and where we can go from here. So with that in mind, I'm just going to dive straight in. Now, there are a lot of definitions of sustainability and sustainable management that you will see out there. The one that I like to use, because frankly, I think it's the simplest while also covering the most, comes right out of Econ 101, which is that sustainable management is all about internalizing externalities. Now, that's too many syllables for a simple definition. But just to be clear, what is an externality? An externality is something that the producers or the consumers of any good or service don't really themselves see such that they can bake it into the cost of producing or consuming that good or service. And that shows up in a variety of ways. Classic conception of an externality is just we have a market, we have a marginal cost of producing something, We have a marginal benefit that people get from its consumption. Producers are going to produce to the point where marginal cost equals marginal benefit. We're going to see some equilibrium price. The problem, of course, is when you think about something like pollution, the most obvious one these days being carbon emissions. Carbon emissions are not tracked. They tend to be an externality. And so we socially bear the cost, but the private producer and consumer do not. That means that we're really talking here about the marginal private cost of producing that good. If we looked at the true marginal social cost, what we would see is that if we took all of those externalities into account, if we internalized them, we'd actually be producing less of that good or service and we'd be charging more for it. And in sort of a classic economics framework, the little yellow triangle I'm showing on the screen represents the aggregate welfare loss to society as a whole due to things like pollution, to climate change, and the rest. The fact that that triangle is not that big mostly shows how this was thought of in terms of things like smog or air quality. In practice, some of these externalities can be gigantic if we think, for example, about the long-term climate effects of industrial production. And to be clear, externalities work in the other direction as well. If there's a benefit that we get from society that the private producer or the private consumer does not necessarily see, then we can just flip that chart around and we're actually going to end up producing less of the good or service than would be socially optimal. This is the classic argument often for initial government subsidies in producing things like green energy, for example, but it also shows up whenever we have spillovers, like co-locations of firms next to one another in cities. That's theoretical. Let me give you some concrete examples, just how this shows up and where these particular type of externalities can come from. One of my favorites to always talk about is renewable energy, because in the 20 years since I started graduate school, I have watched the cost of renewable energies like wind power and solar fall steadily year on year to the point where in many cases they're competitive or even superior at this point to some generation by things like fossil fuels. The challenge has always been, how are we going to actually store the energy that is created? Because of course, sun and wind vary in their strength and speed over time, and yet electrical power has to be generated almost simultaneously with demand. So of course, there's a huge challenge right now in thinking through how we can actually store the energy that's being produced in these cases. And solving that problem has a huge social benefit, but you can imagine the investments that are required in order to create this. No single private investor is necessarily going to recoup the costs involved in doing that. And so in those cases, we have a general technological problem that shows up as an externality that we need to solve. Now, renewable energy is a classic example of this because we focus so much on energy production when we talk about things like climate change. But to be clear, one of my other favorite examples is grocery stores. And if you think about it, grocery stores are insane from a sustainability perspective. You have basically a bunch of individually packaged consumer goods, huge amount of wasteful material, surrounded on all sides by open refrigerators. And so the grocery store, as we typically treat it, is something where the technology for producing more sustainable production and distribution of consumer goods, like you get in a grocery store, we've mostly solved those problems. If you think we haven't, you can just look at how we handled the logistics of shopping for and delivering groceries during lockdown. At this point, we can pick off shelves, we can deliver fairly well. It's more of a logistical problem, both the first order one of doing that at scale across houses, so we no longer have to have people coming to a grocery store in the first place, and then thinking through the second order problems that opens up. For example, that we don't have to have those open refrigerators anymore, or indeed we can reduce the packaging on goods if it's being basically picked from a warehouse and being sent to your home instead of something that's designed to be lifted off of a shelf. So we've talked about technological problems that can be externalities. We've talked about logistical or operational problems. In the wake of everything we've seen from the pandemic, the lockdown, and coming out of it, I also want to notice another externality that people don't necessarily talk about in this sense, but absolutely is part of sustainability, which is the design of our organizations themselves. And by that, what I'm getting at is, I think a lot of employment and the sort of systems we've created for employment in many industries today are themselves unsustainable. Many are the types of industries, investment banking is one, a lot of software production has taken this form, where they essentially use a churn and burn style of recruitment and training. We have a queue of skilled people at the front door. We take them in. We don't invest a lot in their training. Also, we make them work incredibly long hours. People tend to burn out after a couple of years and leave that industry, but people in the industry are expecting it, and so they just hope there's another person at the door. That has a couple of problems when you think about sustainability. One of them obviously is the direct impact on those employees, but also how do you incentivize people to take a long-term perspective or think about goals that may take years or even decades to pay off if they're expecting a given employment contract with a given firm is going to last 18 to 24 months, and a lot of their pay and bonuses are based on quarterly or at most semi-annual performance targets. That's just going to be a problem. And notice that is not a technological problem, and it's not strictly speaking a logistical problem. It really is an organizational question of management. So I mentioned those three examples just to give you a sense of how broad the idea of externalities that individual firms don't necessarily notice and that individual customers don't necessarily pay attention to. And yet these are problems insofar as we're not tracking them, we're not paying attention to them, and we're not accounting for the costs that are involved. That's almost the definition of unsustainable management. And so when we can make those things visible, record them, and design around them, that's a move toward sustainable management. Now notice what I'm describing there is essentially transformative. All the different parts of organizations usually are going to have to pay attention to changing some of their practices for true sustainable management. However, I don't necessarily think that's how a lot of firms are thinking about sustainable management right now. And that brings us into the next point. What are firms usually looking for? We want to make sure as much as possible when we're teaching about sustainable management, we don't just do this off in one course. We want to make sure that our core itself, and I'm using the example here of the 8 substantive classes that we teach in the MBA core in the fall, are covering elements of sustainability as they relate to those different academic areas. So when you think about like accounting or finance, literally, how do we account for externalities? Financially, how do we discount those externalities? If you think about what is the value of something when we've not been taking into account pollution? What is the value created by a firm if we're not paying attention to the cost on its labor force and in society as a whole? At other levels, when we start to think about competing on sustainability, this is where things like strategy and marketing become incredibly important. How do we drive demand for change? How do we make it clear to customers the things that we are doing that affect our costs, but should also affect their willingness to pay if they value sustainability? And how do we think about competing on these things as opposed to exploitation, whether it be of a labor force, natural resources, or the like? So many of the sort of internal facing functions like IT, operations, and organizational behavior have their own versions of those questions of sustainability. Can we track the data we need to internalize those externalities? How do we build a green supply chain? And can we incentivize long-term perspectives and projects inside our organizations? And of course, economics is there because it always shocks me how many people still think that somehow there's a trade-off in doing sustainable management, that somehow it's bad for business to pay attention to these things. I want to be clear. I didn't invent the idea of externalities. This is 150 years old at this point. It's a basic market failure. I believe in sustainable management because I took a lot of economics classes. And so all of these different dimensions, I think, roll into sustainable management. And yet what we see when we ask what firms are looking for around sustainability, the focus in the last, I'm going to say, year to 18 months has very heavily been about reporting and compliance with external regulations. To be clear, I don't think that's at all surprising. After all, mandatory reporting around environmental, social, and governance issues is coming. We know it's going to be there. For example, in Canada, there's going to be mandatory reporting and disclosure beginning in 2024 for many banks and insurance companies and others, based around the idea of the task forces on climate-related financial disclosures, or the TFCD frameworks that are being developed. The International Sustainability Standards Board, which governs CPAs, among others who handle the financial accounting and reporting rules, is developing its own list of mandatory disclosures that are going to be necessary. And in addition to many of those international efforts, we see, for example, the Canadian Securities Administration, the European Commission, the Securities and Exchange Commission in the United States, and others increasingly adding some of their own requirements as it comes to the kind of things that they want to see publicly traded companies reporting in terms of how their activities impact the climate. And to be very clear, this is not just coming from securities regulations and shareholders. Many external stakeholders also want to see this kind of information disclosed. I don't think there's a problem with any of this in and of itself. It is important that we make sure that we can hold organizations accountable for their impacts on society and on the environment. And also, to be clear, most firms at this point are not ready for mandatory reporting. So it's not as though this is easily taken care of and we need to look past that. We are still playing catch up. The vast majority of firms in Canada, for example, do not have a TFCD reporting structure in place yet. And remember that these mandatory requirements are coming in next year. Most of them don't integrate their financial reporting with risk management, which is one of the goals of such a framework. Far too many corporate reports, when they have a section on sustainability, they talk about the positive things that they are doing, and they don't actually discuss the full scope of their operations, including the negatives. And so much of this work at this point is self-reported by companies. And so we see, even though we have a growing sector that does things like consulting for sustainability reporting and for compliance, the amount of actual external auditing and validation of many firms' sustainability objectives still leaves a lot to be desired. I also think there are some things we should notice about those reporting requirements themselves. First, just to be clear, I think sustainability is a much broader concept than environmental sustainability. That's why I mentioned things like your workforce itself. However, I also want to be clear that we're not even necessarily getting the environmental part right yet. We still have progress on this dimension. Nonetheless, where we see mandatory reporting structures being put into place, they really emphasize the E of ESG. The social and governance pieces tend to get pretty short shrift in a lot of this. In addition, the way many of these reporting structures have developed, there is an emphasis by firms to say that we want to focus on the processes that we are putting into place in order to be more sustainable and not be measured strictly on our final outcomes, such as our total levels of emissions or something like it. Because most of this is being done through financial disclosure, and I don't think that that's wrong, it feels incomplete in many cases, we're seeing an increasing focus on the finance function within firms handling that kind of sustainability reporting. And one of the difficulties of that is it means that many other parts of the organization are only directly involved with developing that reporting and compliance insofar as it is filtered through the lens, organizational interests, mandates, and the rest of the finance function. And the last thing to notice with a lot of mandatory reporting is there is understandably an emphasis on harmonized reporting. That is to say, trying to think about the minimum viable set of things we can require as many companies as possible to report. I'll come back to why that's potentially an issue for true sustainability in a minute. Let me talk about the risks there, and I'm going to be blunt in the focus on reporting at this point, and in particular that focus on the processes that firms are putting into place. The risk is that focusing on processes lets you punt. And the reason I say that is my own research is less directly on ESG as it is sometimes talked about, though perhaps I land in the social and governance side more than others. In my spare time, when I'm not running an MBA program at Desautels, I do a lot of work, for example, on employment segregation in different companies and in different countries. Looking at the United States, for example, I want to talk about the other big issue that has been focused on in many firms in recent years, which is EDI, or equity, diversity, and inclusion. This is the model that has often been paid attention to as people are developing mandatory reporting structures around ESG. And I cannot stress this enough, when it comes to diversity reporting, there has long been a focus on processes as opposed to specific outcomes. Many firms 30, 40, 50 years ago said it's unrealistic to expect us to diversify our workforces overnight or even that quickly. And in some cases, they even had good arguments for why that would be the case. For example, that we need a certain number of qualified personnel of different races so that we can be choosing among them. And because of a legacy of discrimination, the requisite personnel don't exist yet with the proper training. And so in many cases, the courts, lawmakers, other companies, and standards boards said, you know what, that's fine. We're going to focus on making sure that if you can't immediately change the composition of your workforce, you're at least going to demonstrate to us that you mean well and you have the right processes, that we don't see discrimination happening in your hiring, evaluation, and promotion processes, for example. And so we went from you need to have an outcome that looks like this to you need to show us that you have processes that aren't necessarily not going to produce this. And I want you to notice the slip there, because what that means is as long as you can show that you're not discriminating under any basic arguments of the law, you can have a workforce that never changes and you are still complying. This is the thing that makes us worried when we hear firms focusing on things like processes as opposed to goals with sustainability reporting. I can imagine a world where firms focus on processes and don't necessarily change a lot of the final outcomes, and yet they can wave their hands and say, we're doing everything we can be expected reasonably to do. Now, if that focus on processes had led to widespread integration of American workplaces, for example, I might be more sanguine about its chances for ESG. And if I can toot my own horn for a minute, this is just a finding showing level of racial segregation between different workplaces in the United States over a 50-year period from a paper I published with one of my students a few years ago. And the key takeaway here is that it looks like a U, which is to say that after a decade of pretty strong enforcement, the level of segregation between workplaces by race throughout the United States is basically back where it was in the 1970s. And so I, for one, am extremely nervous about a focus that on processes within firms as opposed to saying we have outcomes that we need to change. And that comes from a couple of reasons. And the first one, and I want to be very clear about this, I don't think firms are trying to game a system. I don't think that companies are being dishonest when they want the focus to be on things like processes and reporting. Part of the reason why they want the focus there is because there are things that are beyond an individual firm's control, root causes, if you will, that might limit their ability to reduce things like a carbon footprint. In the same way that a firm in and of itself is not responsible for the education of the entire labor force, a firm by itself doesn't necessarily control its entire supply chain. And so there may be a lot of pollutants or carbon basically in the inputs for a firm's production that even if their own processes themselves are quite green, they're going to have a larger footprint than they would otherwise. And so those are all reasonable concerns to think about. The problem, though, is if, as we said at the beginning, sustainable management is really about a systemic transformation in many aspects of firms, then the minute we start to rule out anything that's a root cause as, well, these firms are doing the best they can given the environment in which they operate, we are essentially toning down our final objectives. We're more or less admitting we're not going to get the final outcomes that we would like to see. I mentioned I would come back to the idea of harmonized reporting structures or goals as well. And here I just want to stress, notice the trade-off there, that anytime you have a harmonized figure that you're reporting, there's a trade-off between uptake and impact. Because if you have very different organizations and yet you want to report something common across them, you're going to have to focus on relatively surface level or trivial things. Because as soon as you get into the nitty-gritty of their business, you don't necessarily have something that you can measure or that makes sense across firms. A related point that I think when we say that strategy and marketing is about thinking how could we compete and win on sustainability is that often when we talk about sources of competitive advantage in a business environment, we're usually focusing on things that allow you to differentiate yourself from your competitors. So saying that I comply with, ISO 9001 manufacturing standards. That's like a floor that you hit in order to say we're doing as well as everyone else, but those are the table stakes for competition. That's like saying I run an airline and I don't crash any of the planes. In and of itself, it doesn't make people more likely to fly with you. Indeed, as I often point out to my class, if I ran posters that said fly Ferguson Airlines, we almost never crash, you'd probably be less likely to buy a ticket with me. And so as we think through how firms are going to differentiate themselves in a market with mandatory sustainability reporting, compliance with those standards over time is going to be less and less useful as a distinguishing characteristic for firms. And so what that means is if there's not further impetus for innovation built into those reporting standards, or if we don't have people in those organizations that want to push those ideas further, then we're not necessarily going to see continued innovation around that kind of sustainable management. And the last point I want to stress is very simple. External reporting requirements rarely produce internal change. Many organizations are good eventually at figuring out how to comply with the demands or expectations of external actors without necessarily changing their daily business. And we all do this. And I don't even think it's intentional, criminal, or anything else. It's simply, boy, it's a pain. I'm going to do what I have to do to get these people off of my back. If there's not a committed interest from inside many organizations, then what we eventually end up with is more or less ceremonial compliance with things like reporting regulations those regulations are not themselves driving change in those organizations. All of which is bringing it back to the idea that I think that it's good. I want to be clear. I think it's a good thing that the focus for the last year has very much been on the introduction and phased rollout of mandatory ESG reporting processes within many, many companies. However, as someone who really thinks seriously about organizational change and who teaches about this, I'm left a little nonplussed. And I am both happy that we have this kind of focus developing, and yet at the same time, I'm also concerned that too many people are going to think that we're making too much progress, when in fact, reporting requirements are at best only the start. So as someone who runs an MBA program, I just want to stress 3 key points. The first, as I already said, is I think organizations rarely fix themselves. Generally speaking, we have this question of, and I hear this from students all the time as they think about the kind of careers that they want for themselves. Should I be working in advocacy to help change organizations, or would life be better if I try to change them from the inside? I heard this all the time before I became an academic. I used to work at the World Bank dealing with some of these issues, and we had exactly the same discussions among ourselves. And I just want to stress that I think it's a false dichotomy. You need people who are actively interested in making these changes inside organizations, and they desperately rely on advocacy from outside in order to show people who are not as interested in making those changes that sufficient demand exists to make those efforts worthwhile. If you don't have both of those, you're dead in the water. Next, we need to go beyond, right, just those reporting requirements. We need people inside organizations who recognize that, of course, we need to comply with mandatory reporting. But at the same time, again, if we want to differentiate ourselves, if we want to win on certain elements of sustainability, then we also need to think about how we can do that in our specific firms. And for that, this is where I think an MBA is actually quite useful, because your typical MBA, I think a lot of students, this is off script, but it's important to say, I became a professor at a business school because I wanted to reach people, as weird as this sounds, who want to change the world, but don't always know how. And I think for probably 20 or 30 years, the kind of student that wants to change the world and isn't quite sure how has often chosen getting an MBA as the start of that process. I think 50 years ago, that student might have gone to journalism school. Maybe 40 years ago, they would have gone to law school. The shift, I think, is right now, a lot of those people feel as though the way that I'm going to learn to be effective in organizations is by going to business school. And so I've always hoped to reach those people. And I've hoped to make sure that they get those tools, but they know how to be effective in organizations and what to use that effectiveness for. And so the MBA strikes me as a good degree where we can marry those external desires for organizational change and sustainable management to internal skills and capacities that managers have developed in order to lead and change organizations. And so I think that's one of the spots where potentially, at least, an MBA is quite important in leading those kinds of organizational transformations. And the sharp way I say that is I think we need fewer but better MBAs. And by that I mean, and again, I'm going to take a step back and talk a little bit historically. By the time I was becoming a graduate student, about 20 years ago, the MBA had become a very general purpose degree in the sense that many firms for many functions, if they needed technical skills of any sort, were telling the students or their potential applicants, you need to get yourself an MBA. I think that this was misguided, as do a lot of those companies eventually, when they said, hang on a second, that's a very expensive, potentially proposition for people, not just in money, but also in terms of time. And so we've seen over the last couple of years a hiving off of some of the technical skills associated with MBA training into things like specialized master's degrees. The specialized master's degrees are great. We offer several at Desautels, for example. McGill has specialized masters in finance, analytics, and retail, for example. However, the difference between an MBA and those specialized degrees really is in the general management idea. The goal of an MBA is to train effective leaders to help change organizations. It is not simply a bundle of technical skills, partly because those technical skills age, but the techniques of leadership and management are fairly eternal. And so when I think about talking about organizational transformation, when I think about trying to think about making innovations in firms that cut across existing functions, I want someone who's skilled in general management, because taking a narrow perspective inside a firm and ignoring the things that are hard to measure, not your responsibility, difficult to quantify, or the rest, is exactly how we ended up with so many externalities in the first place. And if we want to internalize those, if we want to have better management, then we need smarter managers as well. And so I think when I titled this talk, What Do Firms Need Now?, I want you to notice there's a difference between what firms need right now and what they want right now. They want reporting and they want compliance. And we train for that. And I want to make sure that anyone who comes out with an MBA from McGill, from Desautels, understands how to handle those reporting and those compliance requirements. But at the same time, I want them to be curious and be thinking, how can we go farther than this? Not just because the whole world needs it, but because it can help my firm compete and win as well. So with all of that said, the way I often like to say this is that smarter management needs smarter managers. And when I give lectures, it's to people that I'm hoping will be the smarter managers of tomorrow. And I'm doing everything I can to make sure that is the case. The emphasis on sustainable management in the MBA at Desautels here at McGill, it comes in part from faculty like me. This is something that keeps me awake at night, worrying about. But it also comes from students. And again, organizations don't change themselves, right? You need people who are interested on the inside, and you need external demand, for example, from interested students, potential students, alumni, and all the rest. The input from our students has been crucial at every stage in this process. And my hope is that we can design a better MBA together. So with that, I'm going to say thank you to everyone who has listened to me talk for more than half an hour on this particular subject. I think we should take the time to transition some to a Q&A. I have one question in the chat going back to the question of what is in the core, and how do you think about why is there not a class on sustainable management within the core itself? This is a great question, and it came up when I was involved in redesigning our MBA several years ago. The thing that I want to stress is many schools, well, actually, let me talk about organizations generally first. When you have demand externally for change in organizations, whether it be a company, a government agency, a school, or something else, the way that those organizations typically respond, at least at first, is they create a special office for that issue. And so you may have a new department, you have a new director, a senior vice president in charge of that issue, or the like. And they spend the first year or so gathering information, meeting with focus groups throughout the organization, formulating a plan of action. And then by 6 months or a year into that process, those same people say, wait a minute, the goal here was not to create a new office, it was to change the way that we do our business. And as someone who teaches management, who teaches organizational behavior, I said, I want us to avoid just repeating that trap again and creating a parallel department or a parallel set of classes that teach sustainability while the rest of the MBA sits entirely unchanged. Our focus, therefore, was that we should try to drive sustainability in the core itself, because that eventually is the medium-term goal here of being able to say, like, I don't want to literally produce graduates who are going to be in the sustainability industry. I want to make sure that a graduate from Desautels is someone who, for example, is a specialist in finance, but at the same time can talk about how we think about climate-related financial disclosure, who understands how we should change applying things like a discount rate once we take into account the environmental impact of some of our investments. All of those things should be tied together. And so I want to make sure that sustainability does not become one track of study for many of our students, but instead is something that shows up across the entire curriculum. It's a great question. I have another here on why firms focus so much on, like, how are they supposed to focus on anything other than processes if they can't control outcomes? And again, I think that's a very good question to be asking at this point, because, and here I think it's very useful to draw a distinction between moderation and radicalism. And when I say I want to draw that distinction, I want to be clear that I want a distinction between those two that doesn't take into account sort of the contents of what we're discussing. Because we all have a tendency to say that, well, moderation is more efficient than radicalism, for example. But that's not really the way to think about these two processes. Let me start with a simple point. If you imagine you have some goal and you're trying to achieve that goal, but then you run into a constraint. This could be that you're trying to sell a new product, but that you think is going to have a huge impact in the world, but there's some sort of regulatory hurdle. Because of the way the regulations were defined, it doesn't take into account technological change. And so you have two options at that point. One is you could modify your goal given the constraint. You could say this technology would be really useful. I think this product would be incredibly helpful, but unfortunately, it's just not going to work given the constraints that we have. I'm going to refer to that as moderation. The other option you have is you could say, given our goal, we need to attack this constraint. That is to say, how can we update these regulations? How can we simplify things so that going forward, we don't run into this problem? I'm going to refer to that as radicalism. And that's the only distinction here between the two, right? It's not a content-based distinction. If you have a goal and you want to keep that goal and you want to attack the root causes that are causing you difficulties, that's being radical. But the goals itself is not necessarily radical. In the same way, that doesn't necessarily mean that moderation is always more efficient. If you have out-of-date regulations, moderating or tempering your goals to deal with those regulations is not necessarily efficient. It might be better to spend some time attacking the root cause, changing the regulation, for example. And so when we ask about what else can we expect firms to do, I just want us to notice that sometimes when we say, well, firms can't control any of these things, therefore, we need to moderate the reporting requirements or the standards that we're creating for firms, we ourselves are engaging in moderation. And there's pressure that we want to put on policymakers then to say, just focusing on the reporting from firms is not going to help us if the firms do not have control over the things that we most want to change. when we see this happening, when we get that pushback, that's often a sign that our regulatory regimes need to go farther, not that they need to simply be pared back based on the demands of firms themselves. It's often more efficient, therefore, to go after some of those root causes in the long run. These are very good questions. How do you think that we as entrepreneurs, we can support the companies we work for and not give the feeling of stepping on anyone's toes? As entrepreneurs, sorry. Daniela, you can tell that I am slowly learning French, having moved to Montreal 5 years ago. But entrepreneurs, I think that here is where I'm going to make a pitch for classes by professors of organizational behavior, such as myself, to be honest. Because we're the ones, I make a joke when I teach my class that organizational behavior, my field made a terrible mistake. 80 years ago, we decided that management didn't sound fancy or scientific enough as the name for our field. So we picked OB, and now no one knows what we do, but we're just the managers, right? And one of the things that I spend a lot of time teaching about in managing organizational behavior is how we exercise influence in organizations. Now, the one that most of us want to jump to right away are the tools of rational persuasion. We think that people should support sustainable practices because it makes sense to support them. As it happens, I agree with that. However, it does often come across as stepping on people's toes. It can appear strident. Also, people may oppose doing those changes in many organizations, not because they don't think they're important. They could oppose them, for example, because this is just something that they are paid to do, or they don't have the resources to support this, or they're worried that in trying to change or learn how to do things differently, during the period where they're learning that, they look less competent than they do when they're exercising the thing that they're already experts at. And so rational persuasion only gets us so far inside organizations. But the number of influence tactics out there are much larger. Think about, for example, building coalitions. It's a lot easier to have a conversation with someone who might resist a change when you can point to the 17 people who you've previously spoken to who are also coming to them, making the same requests. We can think about influence tactics like trading. Literally, I can do you a favor if you do me a favor. I can think about the idea of making appeals to the goals of the firm as opposed to the individual. This is I'm not stepping on your toes or forcing you. I'm giving you the chance to be a hero. Of course, we can think about appeals upward, getting their superiors involved such that that superior might be the person who can change the incentive structure that a resistor faces when they're contemplating change. We can think about literally questions like consultation. This is one of my favorite ones to point out to MBA students, because especially when you're at least at that point in your career, at a lower point in an organizational hierarchy, going and asking for advice can be surprisingly useful as the first step in gaining influence with someone. Because generally speaking, people have an interest in seeing projects on which they have advised succeed. And so getting someone's opinion, talking to them in that context is often a very useful way to begin those conversations where it doesn't feel like you're stepping on someone's toes. If anything, you're coming and you're trying to get advice from them. And as crazy as it sounds, I also sometimes start those conversations just assuming that that person agrees with me on some of the basic points. And then it's a conversation about, I think we both want this. How do we do it? And that skips the entire process of them protesting that obviously they're already in favor of the things that they want to put into place. And so I think in many of these cases, it's worth noticing that the tools of the general manager are a little bit agnostic as to the goals. Everything I've just described, methods of influencing people, forming coalitions, of building clear arguments, you're going to use these regardless of the specific goal that you're working toward. And so but here's the thing, you can learn all you want in terms of all of the details of green supply chains, zero waste operations management or something like that. But then when you go to try to sell that position within a company, you find yourself in the position that you're considered didactic, really strident, confrontational, or the rest. And so for all your information, you can't necessarily push it forward. And so I think that I always want to stress, I think substantive technical knowledge on the part of MBA students is very important. But I also think that the tools of management themselves and the tools of being effective in organizations are often understated in their importance. And so that's why I think some of the best managers marry people who have really good technical really good technical skills with their ability to provide support and influence inside organizations. It's a very good question, because many of us think that these are issues that we can only win in organizations through having fights. And yet the irony, of course, is that if we deploy all of the tools of many businesses, a lot of gains for sustainability these days are potentially win-win, right? Because so much about internalizing an externality is about making sure that, like, the reason we created externalities in the first place is we had things that we didn't really understand how to measure. And so we've just been trying to ignore them. And we've created one-size-fits-all solutions. And yet the more data we have, right, the more analytic decisions we can take in order to create organizations where we can customize our solutions to different things. Like, I always think about, there's been a huge push of the use of analytics in medicine as we increasingly focus on personalized healthcare, with the idea of tailoring our medical interventions to a specific person's health history, family history, genetics, the whole 9 yards, right? And we can make very customized interventions to help those people. When you think about operations in many firms, that's the direction we want to go. And yet that requires very agile organizations. But so many of the things that I'm saying that sustainability needs, like a better analytic capacity, organizational agility, well, these are things that are discussed in business schools, in leadership conferences, in books that you read, in TED Talks that you've probably watched. We all want to move in this direction anyway. And this, by the way, comes back to a classic model of how to think about how organizations compete that was developed in Scandinavia in the wake of the Second World War, actually by the Trade Union Federation. The LO is the acronym for it. So it's often called the LO model. The basic argument was, we don't think that your ability to exploit a workforce, like by longer hours, lower wages, abuse at the work, etc., like those shouldn't be the dimensions upon which a firm successfully can compete. Like, if you can only succeed in the market because you pay your people less, right, than is ideally legally possible, or you force them to work longer hours, that dimension should be ruled out. And so if we create legal floors for some of this kind of behavior, we're going to force firms to be more efficient on other dimensions that we think are more important and more socially beneficial. And so this is the argument that, yes, we run a high-cost economy, but the idea is that the inefficient firms on those dimensions do go out of business, and they're replaced by firms that figure out how to do these things more efficiently. Let's stress that that basic logic is built into so much of the regulatory framework for sustainable management that we're trying to develop today. Like, we don't think a firm should succeed in the marketplace because it has greater carbon emissions. For example, because it uses a cheaper fuel that has a bigger externality in terms of pollution. And so insofar as we're applying the same idea, it's here as well. The trick then is to educate people on why competing on some of those dimensions is something that consumers, for example, should be willing to pay for. Great. Insofar as someone might be typing, we shall see. But while that's going on, let me take this opportunity, therefore, to say these are always fun for me to give. I think that I said one of the reasons why I became the academic director at McGill Desautels is because I liked talking to young people who wanted to change the world but don't know how. That's still very much a large part of this job. And the opportunity for me to discuss some of these issues, for me, ideally, they come up in almost every class in some form. But to be able to lay them out in one place is often very useful for me as I think about how we go into the next year, how we iterate upon the MBA program we've already created, and how we can make some of that just stick more. Because I think the MBA it's an underappreciated tool by many people. And I say that because a lot of us don't think about organizations as such. We don't necessarily go to work in a firm to run the firm. The person who does that, you don't want to work for them. We go to work for firms because we like what the firm does in a lot of cases. And we want to contribute to that. But of course, one of the ironies is that the better you are at doing whatever it is that firm does, the sooner you get promoted. And the sooner you find yourself doing less of that every day and you spend your time running the firm instead. And a lot of us never learn to run the firm. Like, we don't train people in college in a lot of cases on actual management, which is why the MBA is so important. You've gained experience, you've seen things you want to change, but you don't know how. And we provide the environment for people who want to change organizations and who want to run organizations better, to develop that set of skills. And so to have the chance during the summer to sit back, think about these things, and think about how they relate to larger changes we want to make is one of the really rewarding parts of my job. Thanks very much, everyone.